This week on The Impact, things get heated as both candidates running to be the next Commissioner of Public Lands sound off in the studio.
My opponent's plan is the industry's plan. These lands don't belong to industry. They don't belong to big business. They belong to we the people. They're public lands. They're our lands.
He wants to set this land aside for these activists. My opponent's talking about taking $2 billion worth of timber off the books, out of schools. And he keeps saying he'll find it elsewhere. Where are you going to find $2 billion?
From wildfire response and prevention to timber revenue for schools, clean energy siting and legacy forests, we cover it all.
My opponent, on the other hand, would take us in the wrong direction, voting to roll back clean water protections, voting to gut the Endangered Species Act, voting to take us backwards on climate.
You've spent more time in government, and you have less to show for it. You know, for my work in Congress, whether Republican or Democrat, I worked with Democrats to get done.
That's all coming up on The Impact. Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. Who should control Washington's 5.6 million acres of public land? Voters will decide this fall by choosing the next Commissioner of Public Lands. As head of the Department of Natural Resources, DNR, the Lands Commissioner sets access rules, fire prevention policies, and manages millions of acres of trust lands to make money for schools and county services, often through timber sales. They also lead Washington's largest firefighting force. DNR is the first line of defense against the devastating wildfires that happen annually in forests and grasslands. Beyond that, the agency manages aquatic lands, issues leases for rural oyster farms and urban marinas, auctions wild geoduck permits, and maps geologic risks like lahar paths and tsunami zones. The Lands Commissioner is also one of the state's key decision makers on habitat conservation plans for endangered species like the northern spotted owl and marbled murrelet. Some of the big issues in this year's race are DNR's approach to trust land management and the way the agency generates revenue for schools and counties. There's debate over proposed logging restrictions on pre-World War II timber stands called legacy forests. And there are questions about whether DNR should repurpose land for clean energy siting or carbon offsets. Joining me now, the Democratic candidate for Lands Commissioner Dave Upthegrove, chair of the King County Council, and the Republican candidate Jaime Herrera Beutler, former Congresswoman for Washington's 3rd District. Thank you both for your time today. Jaime, I'd like to start with you. If you could encapsulate sort of why your background and led you to this decision and why you're running for this office.
So my husband Dan and I are raising our 3 kiddos in the path of the Alcolt burn, which stood for over a century as the largest forest fire in Washington state history. But in just this last 10 years, that terrible record has already been surpassed 3 times. So too many of our forests are undermanaged or outright neglected, and they've turned into crowded, diseased tinderboxes, and they're waiting for a spark. Fires run rampant every summer. They're filling our days with smoke and emitting tons of carbon into the air, and they're making home insurance here even more affordable. So, you know, I've decided I'm not going to leave my kids or your kids a legacy of burning forests and choking smoke. I'm running for Lands Commissioner because I want to change the way that this is happening and make sure that we can pass on to the next generation the things that I got to grow up with here that make Washington state special.
And Dave, tell us about your background as far as how it's prepared you for this role and why you're running, please.
Sure. Managing our public lands in the public interest for all the people of the state of Washington is what voters deserve. And our world is changing. We're seeing the impacts of climate change all around us. We're seeing a rapid loss in biodiversity. And I'm running to improve the management of our public lands to meet these realities of today. And voters in Washington state have strong conservation values, and I'm going to carry those values with me into this office as commissioner. You know, voters also deserve a candidate who's independent-minded, thoughtful, and balanced, and I will be that leader. You know, my priorities are simple. I want to protect our clean air, clean water, and habitat. I want to improve wildfire prevention and response, and I want to increase the recreational opportunities on state lands. And at the end of the day, these lands don't belong to industry. They don't belong to big business. They belong to we the people. They're public lands. They're our lands.
So transitioning here, let's talk wildfire first. The previous Commissioner of Public Lands successfully got funding to expand the aerial firefighting capabilities and also pushed for more permanent firefighter positions in the role. As head of DNR, you'd be in charge of the lead wildland firefighting agency. Do you have a strategy to improve our wildfire response?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I think we need to make sure that we're fully funding it. When my opponent was in the legislature as chair of the environmental subcommittee, he didn't fully fund firefighting response as part of the DNR, which was under his purview. And our current commissioner had to go to bat. She did a great job propping up, fixing, and triaging our fire response system. But we need to do more. We need to make sure the aerial teams in Eastern Washington have on contract immediate planes that can respond, that they have the ability to fight those fires and not always wait for the state mobilization. We need to make sure that we're also doing the work upstream of the forest fire, which means managing our forests well, for the benefit of the trust, for the benefit of the people of Washington, not setting them aside and watching them deteriorate or, God forbid, burn. For the first time last year, in all of recorded history, we've had more fires on the wet side or the west side of Washington state than on the east side. That's because things are changing. It's also because we need to do a better job of managing our forests. And that's one of the things I'm passionate about doing, should voters send me to this role.
And what's your perspective on wildfire?
Sure. Preventing wildfire, improving response, it's critical for public safety. And for me, the key is going upstream to prevention. They say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's why I'm interested in increasing the work on forest health. Our current commissioner has done an exceptional job in terms of treating lands in eastern Washington. And I want to expand that work into western Washington with things like increasing our controlled burns, our commercial thinning, our non-commercial thinning, and also not overlooking things like invasive weed removal and land management that can help keep those lands safe. You know, when I was in the legislature, I voted for wildfire funding every opportunity I had. And it's a stark contrast to my opponent. A few years back, our entire congressional delegation voted for $100 million in wildfire prevention response. Even the other members of the Northwest delegation were willing to break with their party and support this funding. My opponent, on the other hand, was the only member of the delegation to vote against $100 million in wildfire funding, instead siding with the Tea Party extremists in her own party, putting that ideology ahead of public safety. I think that's why the Washington State Council of Firefighters have endorsed this campaign. They know what's at stake, and they know I'm the one who's going to prevent wildfires and protect public safety.
And to be clear, if there are responses where you want to follow up immediately, you can just ask me. We can do that. If you want to respond at this point, we can do that.
Absolutely. So I do believe that it's important. You know, I helped write the bill that was put in place that over 10 years to 2027, we put $2 billion in place for wildfire response and funding, including riparian habitat and ladder fuels reduction, hazardous fuels reduction. I wasn't going to be manipulated by my party or any party when it comes to what bills I'm going to support just because they package them up right. So I got to put in place more than enough to bring money to the state. But at the state level, it still needed to get to our DNR. And unfortunately, when my opponent had committee control and legislative control, he didn't put that money in place, and which is why our current commissioner had to go fight for it. And this is the other important thing. He keeps talking about wanting to have this in place for the public lands. My opponent has a plan to set aside 80,000 acres on day one of trust land. This is harvestable land that's part of the Habitat Conservation Plan, and that money is supposed to go to school districts in Washington State. Forks, Mount Baker, Quilcene, Concrete, Sultan, Port Angeles, Sequim, Rochester, Tumwater, Olympic, Wahkiakum have all come before the Board of Natural Resources begging, essentially, to have their money restored through the Timber Trust Land program. And my opponent is telling them, because of activists in his ear that have said, set that land aside, we're going to set it aside and walk away. This election is about the future of our public lands in Washington State. And my opponent has radical, extreme voices, not hardworking voices of Washington businesses, you know, folks like the pulp and paper workers who have endorsed me in this race, who depend on this timber economy. He wants to set this land aside for these activists. Meanwhile, all these school districts that I've mentioned and more are losing money. Schools are closing across our state, and at this time is not the time to be cutting teachers. It's not the time to be increasing class sizes, but that's what this trust is about. That's what this race is about. And this should be about science, not politics. I'm very excited to be running for this and to champion children in our state.
Do you have a response?
Sure. Fortunately, what she's saying isn't true. My plan is to fund our schools and our public services. What I'm proposing is that we make some modest changes to where we harvest in the short term in order to fulfill the responsibilities we have under existing plans and policies. By listening to the science that created our habitat conservation plan, we're going to do what's right for sustainable forestry. Let me explain. We entered into an agreement with the federal government some time ago, and it has always been the objective of that plan to restore 10 to 15% of our lowland evergreen forests to old growth like conditions in each part of the state. And that's in that plan, and it's also in the policies adopted by the department. I want to bring those to life and make sure we're complying with those policies that were created by scientists in these agencies and embraced by a wide range of stakeholders. Why is that important? Because sustainable forestry into the future by definition means sustaining healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and that's what the scientists said was necessary to ensure sustainable forestry in this state into the future. You don't have to destroy these lush, evergreen, special places that are important to habitat and climate in order to prevent wildfires or in order to keep forests healthy. My opponent's plan is the industry's plan. It's doubling down on the same old way of doing things, which is log, baby, log. I believe we can do better. Of course I'm going to fund our schools and public services. I'm married to a teacher. I've always fought for public school funding. My opponent, as a longtime member of the Republican Congress, voted time and time again to cut education funding, voting to cut Pell Grants for low-income kids in her district. In fact, the National Education Association gave her an F rating. And if the Education Association can't trust her to fund our schools, how can the people of the state of Washington?
I do think we should respond to that because the things I bring up are directly related to his plan for the Commissioner of Public Lands. He's bringing up things that have absolutely nothing to do with this race. Scorecards, rankings, all those things have nothing to do with this race. So it's important. He's talking about the Habitat Conservation Plan, which I support and will wholeheartedly uphold. In that plan, there is an agreement. There's a certain amount of land set aside, about 100,000 acres for special conservation. There's about 49% left that's supposed to be sustainably harvested over time, and that money goes as revenue to these school districts. That's why they're going before the board saying, don't pause our sales because of activists, please go through with them. He wants to take another 10% out of that piece and set it aside. The Habitat Conservation Plan that he references specifically calls this land out to be harvested. It recognizes the set-aside acreage. There's about 400,000 acres of set-aside land on which we are growing old growth. His plan that he keeps talking about, he's going to find other places somewhere else to harvest in the future. That's actually going to break the Habitat Conservation Plan. Right now, I have a letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife that contradicts what he's saying. He's saying that we have to set more of this land aside in order to meet their goals. They say in this letter, this is from 2021, that the plan in place as is written will get us to the place where we are reaching our goals. And in this plan, we pull some of this land out, not all of it, not old growth, not the sensitive areas, but the areas set aside for harvest to make sure that our schools are getting money. But activists are saying, not in my backyard, don't cut that stand, don't cut this stand. And what's happening is he's choosing them over these school districts I've mentioned. Millions of dollars, $25 million in King County, $11 million here in Thurston County. In Whatcom County, the Mount Baker School District used to get $1.2 million a year. This year they're getting $107,000. That school district sent a letter saying, if you guys do this, we're already under conservatorship from OSPI. We have already cut teachers. We have already increased class sizes. What else? They said, quote, nothing else we can do that won't further harm the students. That is my opponent's plan in this race, not in past races, in this race. And it's not good for Washington families. It's not good for our forests, and it's not good for our environment.
At some point, we have to cut off the response, but hopefully maybe this can be it. We can move forward and then contain future responses to the closing, if that's okay.
Sure. You always have to worry when your opponent describes your plan to you. In this case, it's inaccurate. I am supporting the Habitat Conservation Plan. The letter she shares doesn't surprise me. I want the Department of Natural Resources to live up to that plan. The good news is there are other parcels to harvest. A quick cursory look at the forest inventory data shows that there's about 220,000 acres of forest lands that are of the appropriate age and are not locked off in conservation that could be harvested. We harvest about 10,000 acres a year, give or take a little bit. That means well into the future, we just simply harvest other parcels of land maintain the funding for our schools and for those public services. I heard in that last response every timber industry talking point that the industry and Republicans use to try to scare voters. We shouldn't be pitting kids against trees. We shouldn't be pitting the environment against jobs and economic sustainability. In the legislature, I was a leader of something called the Blue-Green Alliance, brought together economic interests and environmental interests, rejected that false choice between jobs and the environment, and advanced sustainable economic solutions. And that's what I'm doing here, bringing creative ideas forward to change the old way of doing things, to make sure our forests are nurtured and stewarded for healthy for future generations, to fund our schools, fund our public services, and meet our obligations to our climate and to habitat.
So I want to change tracks here if we can and talk about clean energy siting. This is a topic that is, there's a lot of energy around the topic, so to speak, in Washington, and sometimes it's controversial where these projects are sited. At the same time, we are barreling towards deadlines that the legislature has set without the adequate infrastructure in place to meet those goals. What's your perspective on that issue and how or if state lands factor in?
So I think the number one responsibility that this commissioner has is to the benefit of the people of the state of Washington, in particular the trust. According to the U.S. Supreme Court and the state Supreme Court, we have to return revenues to the counties, to the schools, right? So we look at the productivity of land. A lot of these lands in the Habitat Conservation Plan have been set aside for harvest today or future harvest, right? And in doing that, we're going to create a more healthy, fire resilient forest system. We're going to protect our old growth. Now, there are other lands. Eastern Washington, for example, has tremendous agricultural and grazing land. There's tide lands along the coast. There's a tremendous amount of natural resource that this office manages, and there are parcels that are not as productive, right? And I've worked with, there's a local legislator in Eastern Washington, Central Washington, who has a proposal that would take land that's within the urban growth boundary, that's not being actively farmed or harvested, that is really not good for any of those traditional uses, and wants to do a tax credit for affordable housing on that land. If they're going to build affordable housing, they'll get a tax credit for it. So in that way, we would be turning that land more productive for the people of the state of Washington. And I'm open to that when it comes to energy projects. I'm open to that when it comes to how are we going to get the best use out of it. The one thing I will not stand for and do not want to see, though, is conversion. I don't want to see forest land or agricultural land or tide lands converted when they are active and productive. I want to protect them. We are the evergreen state. I don't want to be the ever-brown state. I want to make sure that we're continuing to steward our resources. We get this, we get told that it's either the environment or it's the economy. We get told that because of climate change, we just have to manage a decline. And I completely reject that. We have innovation and technology and the best practices in the world when it comes to farming, when it comes to forestry. We can make sure that we're doing it in a smart, responsible way here, keeping those jobs here rather than importing those wood products or those other products and exporting our guilt. Part of the reason I think that labor has been stepped up to support me in this race, the IUPAT, the American Pulp and Paper Workers, is because they know that we can both respect our economy and our environment, and those rural communities don't have to suffer. And when it comes to energy projects, I want to make sure that we're keeping in with the spirit of the responsibility of this office, which is to make sure we're producing for the people of the state of Washington.
What's your perspective on the issue?
Yep. I'm excited to use this position to help Washington State meet our clean energy goals. The legislature adopted some requirements that we need to be energy neutral by 2030 and that all utilities in this state have to produce energy from clean sources by 2045. And we're getting old, it's sneaking up on us quickly. And so there's a demand for utility scale wind and solar and other energy sources. And I think this agency can help us meet that goal. I've proposed the development of a new clean energy trust where revenue generated from new expanded investments in wind and solar be put back into rural communities for economic development in those rural areas. I also think it's important for us to work upfront collaboratively with tribal governments, with local governments, with agriculture, with environmental community to make sure that we're siting these in appropriate places and being considerate of those. It's critical we do our part to meet our clean energy future. And I think our records, both of us are legislators, we have long records, and this race is about values, and our records say something about our values and how we'll approach energy issues. My opponent is a longtime member of the Republican Congress, voted time and time again with the fossil fuel industry, pushing the Keystone Pipeline, voting to exempt them from liability requirements, supporting pulling us out of the climate Paris Accords, opposing the Climate Commitment Act that would fund a lot of this work. I want to move us forward on clean energy and help us meet those targets for the next generation.
Since my opponent is bringing up my congressional record, I think it's important to note I am not running for Congress. I'm actually running for the Commissioner of Public Lands. He's not running against a Republican running for Congress. He's running against a Republican who's independent-minded and has demonstrated a willingness to stand up to my party or to stand up to anyone when it's in the best interest of Washingtonians. I call on him to do the same thing when it comes to these activists who are trying to get him to set aside $2 billion worth of assets. So he's talking about creating a new fund and spending money, and creating a new fund and spending money. What I keep thinking is, where are the results? He keeps saying, well, we'll harvest this somewhere else. When you set aside $2 billion worth of an asset because an activist told you to, and that money doesn't go to our schools and our communities, where are you going to get that money? The OSPI just called for an additional $2.9 billion to be given to schools. They just put it out. He's going to be requesting of the legislature. My opponent's talking about taking $2 billion worth of timber out of the Habitat Conservation Plan, off the books, out of schools. And he keeps saying, he'll find it elsewhere. Where are you going to find $2 billion? Do you think that the legislature is going to give you $2 billion to replace this valuable asset? You don't have to come up with a new program to send money to rural communities. They can take care of themselves. Let them do the work to keep the forest healthy, to keep their people employed, to fund their schools. They don't need a government official telling them what to do with their public land. You know, records are important. When you were chair of the environmental subcommittee, the special environmental areas didn't get funded.
Pause you 1 second. We're
Yeah.
we're at 2.5 minutes. So
Okay.
if you could convert this also into your closing.
I will do it.
And then, if that
I will
works
do
for
it.
you, respond in your closing.
I think, so in keeping with that, while you were chair of the environmental subcommittee, the special areas, the environmental areas within the DNR did not get funded. The recreational areas did not get funded. Both those programs had to go hand to mouth to get grants to do the maintenance work. And you want to add more land to that? You didn't fund the riparian easement program that helps small forest landowners make sure that they're meeting their needs. You didn't fund the program to remove derelict vessels to make sure that we're cleaning up the Puget Sound. Chinook salmon are in crisis today, and you take credit for the Puget Sound Partnership. You've spent more time in government, and you have less to show for it. You know, for my work in Congress, whether Republican or Democrat, I worked with Democrats to get done. And I think that this place in this role needs to be about getting stuff done for the people of Washington.
And if you could respond and wrap us up with your closing remarks.
Absolutely. I get it. We set some big, ambitious goals in this region, and we're continuing to make progress. The question is, are we going in the right direction? And the answer is yes. My opponent, on the other hand, would take us in the wrong direction, supporting and voting for policies and apparently continuing to support policies that take us backwards, voting to roll back clean water protections, voting to gut the Endangered Species Act, voting to take us backwards on climate. My vision for the future is one where we're protecting clean water, not rolling back standards, where we're improving habitat, not weakening the Endangered Species Act, and one where we support our climate future, not oppose the Climate Commitment Act. We can get big things done in this state, and in order to have good jobs and a strong economy, we need to keep Washington State a great place to live.
We will have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your time. We appreciate both of you for coming down here and talking to our viewers, the voters. Still ahead, what's the bottom line for minimum wage earners next year? A look at where Washington's base pay rate is heading in 2025. Stay with us.
It will dwarf Katrina. It'll be absolutely the largest thing that we will have had to have dealt with in our country. We know the clock is ticking.
With only 15 minutes or so, that's not a lot of time to evacuate.
Washington's highest in the nation state minimum wage will rise again next year. The State Department of Labor and Industries announced the 2025 minimum wage for all employees ages 16 and up will be $16.66 an hour, starting on January 1st of 2025. For 14 and 15-year-old workers, the 2025 minimum wage will be $14.16. The rate increase is based on L&I's year-to-year comparison of the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers. Some cities have a higher local minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. The Impact is available anytime online in video and podcast form at tvw.org, and follow us on X at The Impact TVW. Our election coverage continues next week. We hope you'll join us then. Thank you for watching, and have a great week.